The Vietnam War was one of the longest and most controversial conflicts in American history. Lasting from 1955 to 1975, it involved over 2.7 million American soldiers, more than 58,000 U.S. service members were killed, and hundreds of thousands more returned home physically wounded or carrying invisible psychological scars. Unlike previous wars, Vietnam exposed soldiers to constant guerrilla warfare, unclear battle lines, and repeated trauma. Many veterans returned struggling with nightmares, anxiety, depression, addiction, and emotional withdrawal, symptoms that had no clear medical name at the time. For generations, combat trauma had been ignored, renamed, or dismissed, but after Vietnam, that silence began to break. The Vietnam War sparked a revolution in public awareness of combat-related mental health, leading to intense political and social reaction, which ultimately drove major reforms in veteran care and the modern understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD.
What became groundbreaking after the Vietnam War was that veterans publicly spoke for themselves about their psychological wounds. Vietnam Veterans Against the War, or VVAW, founded in 1967 by veterans, became the first large-scale platform where veterans openly described trauma, moral injury, and the psychological impact of war. In the book, the Turning historian Andrew Hunt shows how VVAW members' first-hand testimonies broke the long-standing culture of silence expected of returning soldiers.
And we are asking Americans to think about that. Because how do you ask a man to be the last man to die in Vietnam? How do you ask a man to be the last man to die for a mistake?
Veterans' personal testimonies created a new form of activism, led by soldiers rather than politicians or doctors. Their openness about emotional suffering helped spark the early understandings of post-Vietnam syndrome, which later contributed to the creation of PTSD as a diagnosis in 1980. Not everyone agreed that psychological trauma should be taken seriously. Many military leaders argued that modern training and shorter tours had reduced mental breakdowns, insisting that most soldiers were simply experiencing temporary stress. These views reflected on a long-standing belief that emotional suffering was a sign of weakness, not injury, and they slowed early efforts to recognize post-Vietnam syndrome. PTSD's introduction in 1980 was revolutionary. It provided a universal diagnosis recognized in both military and civilian contexts and acknowledged a full range of symptoms. The Vietnam War triggered a break from the previous way trauma was understood. Trauma understanding evolved from shell shock and battle fatigue to post-Vietnam syndrome and finally to PTSD. After Vietnam, mentions of trauma rose sharply, even as troop numbers fell, reflecting a cultural shift toward openly discussing mental illness and veterans' experiences. This ensured trauma would no longer fade into obscurity as it had in previous wars.
I want you to start singing. Come on. And it's 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. The next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7. Open up the pearly gates. Well, I ain't no time to wander.
In 1980, the American Psychiatric Association officially added post-traumatic stress disorder to the DSM-3. The DSM-3, published in 1980, introduced a multi-axial system and clear definitions for mental disorders. The DSM-3 marked a major reform in psychiatry and veteran care. Vietnam veterans, nearly 700,000 of whom required mental health support, publicly testified and pressured institutions to take psychological trauma seriously.
Post-traumatic stress disorder is very real. People who experience trauma of any sort, whether it's military service or a traumatic event, can have flashbacks, can have extreme stress and anxiety responses.
Earlier labels like shell shock and battle fatigue were often dismissed. DSM-3 replaced them with a standardized diagnosis, correcting decades of neglect. The advocacy, testimonies, and anti-war activism of Vietnam veterans forced the nation to confront a reality it could no longer ignore. The psychological wounds of war did not disappear when the fighting ended. What began as protest and testimony became policy and reform. ensuring that the invisible wounds of war would no longer be ignored.
When Vietnam veterans returned home, they expected support. Instead, many faced rejection, denial, and silence. The reaction of the government, the military, and the public deeply shaped veterans' mental health for decades. The government was slow to admit veterans were struggling. Within the Department of Veteran Affairs, many mental health claims were denied, often because PTSD was not officially recognized until 1980. From the government's view, there was not enough medical proof. From the veterans' point of view, it felt like betrayal. The military also downplayed psychological trauma. Leaders believed modern training and shorter tours had reduced mental breakdowns. As a result, emotional suffering was seen as weakness, not injury. Many soldiers were told to endure the pain rather than receive treatment, making it harder to seek help even after returning home. Public reaction added another layer of hardship. As the war became unpopular, anger toward the conflict often turned into anger toward the soldiers themselves. Many veterans were blamed for a political failure they did not choose and faced stigma instead of support.
I looked at my life and something's wrong.
These reactions created a system that failed Vietnam veterans, but their struggle also sparked change. Through activism and testimony, veterans pushed the nation toward recognizing PTSD, reforming veteran care, and beginning new conversations about mental health in the military. Vietnam veterans speaking PTSD support groups, VA hospitals, and modern soldiers. The story of Vietnam veterans shows that war does not end when the soldiers come home. For many, the battle continued inside their minds. The government was slow to recognize veterans' suffering. Psychological trauma was often understated within military institutions, and the public, divided by protests and politics, often turned away from those who served. But Vietnam veterans refused to remain silent. Through activism, testimony, and organizations like Vietnam Veterans Against the War, they forced the nation to confront the psychological costs of combat. Their struggle led to reform. The VA expanded mental health services. New treatments were developed, and for the first time, trauma was understood not as weakness, but as a human response to extreme events.
Their advocacy sparked a national conversation about the responsibility of the government to care for its soldiers. Policies were written, research on PTSD was funded, and programs for veterans' reintegration into society was established. Vietnam veterans also transformed public perception of war. By speaking openly about their experiences, they challenged myths of heroism and glory, revealing the human cost of combat and psychological scars carried home. Their voices influenced not just healthcare, but culture. Films, literature, and news media began to portray the realities of war with honesty, helping the nation confront uncomfortable truths and learn from them.
This day and this ceremony is for you, for those who served during that war.
The legacy of Vietnam veterans reshaped how America understands war, mental health, and responsibility to those who serve. Their voices ensured that invisible wounds would no longer be ignored, and that future generations of soldiers would not have to suffer in silence. In their stories, Vietnam veterans changed history.